Okay.
All righty. Okay, so my name is Dan Alongo. I am call sign KK7IOD. I've only been an amateur radio operator for 6 months, but I've been a professional at breaking electronic things all my life. So today's subject is radio communications for your network, neighborhood. And we do our Sunday net and we do our, all of our radio check-ins and stuff like that. And we're all experienced ham radio operators. But this subject is about how do we get inexperienced people or people who aren't interested in adopting a new hobby to adopt radio as a new tool. And I should note that that did not work. Let me close that. Throughout my presentation, I have quotes from different people. This doesn't mean any sort of endorsement of political or ideological views from these people. They just happen to be interesting quotes. Yeah. Go forward in life with a twinkle in your eye and a smile on your face, but with great purpose and heart. So first we'll set the table with what are the subjects that we'll hit in this presentation. But I wanted to start first off with a message of optimism. Frequently when we're doing emergency preparation, it's very tempting to talk about all of the different things that could happen, right? There could be tornadoes and hurricanes and floods and all of this stuff. And yes, it's important to recognize the scenarios where we might need to be prepared, but some people react very negatively to those fearful situations. So we want to enforce that this idea of preparation is so that we can come together as a community and survive together. So we'll talk about the initial purpose, the scope of what our preparations will entail, and then the preparations themselves. Our roles as ham radio operators within our neighborhoods as mentors, coaches, team leads, and teachers. We'll have a small, it's a very cut down version of our Sunday evening net, afternoon net that we participate in for our neighborhood. And that'll be about 3 minutes as an example. And then we'll talk about what we can do to then go forward with this. So first off, we'll talk about the task and purpose of our emergency communications. And I've got here a picture of police in riot gear. Any number of things may happen, to include civil unrest and all these other things, and they're all scary scenarios, as we talked about. So how do we then prepare in a way that makes sense for those types of scenarios? The mission defines the strategy, and the strategy defines the structure. So we keep in mind first and foremost what it is that we're trying to accomplish before we go out and figure out how we're going to accomplish it. And to that end, the primary purpose that we have in mind is to determine the status of the members in our community within our quote unquote local scope during an emergency event. What does that mean? What's community? Community can be friends, family, neighbors, associates, people who share a common interest, belief, or goal. I think most people share the common interest in remaining alive and well and healthy. But I want to define community as something that is more than just, I happen to belong to this religious affiliation. I know many of us are LDS. There are plenty of people that live among us and near us who are nice people, wonderful people, who are not members of that same church. And we want to make sure that we can reach out to everyone, not just those who are subscribing to the same religious belief. And so, yeah. And so we want to cast a wider net, that we want to define community as those who are around us. And knowing who is available and what skills each person has to contribute to the community and our community plan helps us build then this tool chest of what are the skills that we can have access to in an emergency, right? If I know that my neighbor is an EMT or a nurse or a doctor, that's great and that's helpful. But it's also really helpful to know if my neighbor has a chainsaw, for instance, if there's a downed tree. It's also really helpful to know if my neighbor knows how to work a generator, et cetera, et cetera. So just kind of having a community interest in building a skills inventory, regardless of what we end up doing with radio, this is what we really want to accomplish in our community plans. In the dark, all cats are gray. And I have a cell phone tower here. Frequently, we talk about radio in terms of how are you going to get a hold of anybody when the cell phone service is overwhelmed or unavailable, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when we're in the dark, it's very difficult to understand what is in our surrounding, what is around us. So information gathering, what do you see from this side of the neighborhood? Well, it's flooding on my side of the neighborhood, et cetera, is something that really empowers and enables us. And so that's why in the dark, all cats are gray. We talk about the local scope as our individual neighborhood. Why do we start there? Well, because we live there. And it's easier to talk about where we live than where we may work. Frequently, we change where we work more often than where we live. But as we discussed earlier, we should always plan for what to do during the day as well. We're not always guaranteed to be at home when there are emergency things to take care of. But that's where we'll start. Is your business when the wall next door catches fire? So many people, when they do their preparations for emergencies, adopt a mindset of, every man for himself. I'm an island. I'm going to close my doors and shut my windows, and it's just me against the world. And it's very easy to plan in that kind of scenario because nobody else exists outside of your front door. But in real life, if your neighbor's house catches fire, it puts you in peril too. So being connected with your neighbors makes sense. And I know it sounds like common sense, but how frequently, I know I've been very guilty of this, how frequently have we planned for what happens if the neighbor's unit below us or above us, right next to us, for those of us that share walls and floors, what happens if that unit is in peril? Go ahead, Paul.
And I just want to mention here that something I've noticed a lot, especially if you look at ham radio videos on YouTube, is that there's a large number of people coming into the amateur radio hobby from the prepper movement, whose whole focus is how can I communicate with my family if we're split up. One of the guys actually has a series of videos called No Random Contacts.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's kind of a tough one because ham radio's tradition is figuring out how to pool skills, use networks to not only get what you need, but offer help to other people. And so I don't know whether that's driven by some of the isolation we see from social media taking over personal interaction. A lot of people just don't want to talk to strangers, or that we teach our kids that, or what. But that may be something to overcome with your neighbors if they've never even thought about ham radio. A walkie-talkie is going to be overheard by people, and they're going to overhear other people. Mm-hmm. And that has to be a factor in any kind of training you do.
100% agree, Paul. So I'm not sure if you're able to hear him clearly, but he brought up that there's a large amount of interest in radio from those who are preppers, and the prepper mentality typically states that you only want to talk to known contacts. You don't actually want to talk to strangers. And there are many groups that engender this philosophy. And I researched some of them in preparation for this presentation. There's the React group and the Amron group and the Tarpon group and the Channel 3 project and any number of these groups. And they have, at least according to their websites, thousands of people who follow their philosophies of communication practices. And that's spread far and wide. I have a friend of mine, for example, in Pennsylvania, who I've had to kind of broach some of that subject with him, because that mentality of, well, no, I only want to talk to the people in my group, or I only want to talk to known patriots, or I need encrypted comms, or et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot to overcome first before you can even agree on the idea that open communication that other people in your area can hear is an acceptable thing. So thank you for bringing that up. Oh, did I crash? All right. No, it's just my keyboard is being silly. All right, so our objective number one is to build good relationships with our neighbors, right? They're not going to want to talk to us or associate with us in an emergency if they don't want to talk to us or associate with us on a non-emergency day. Oh no, what's going on? All right, it's easier to work on solutions to problems when you don't have to also learn names and faces at the same time, right? So rather than you over there, and you over there, and you're always in front of my garage. Blah. Instead of that, you can use names. We use call signs. Normal people use names. It's the same thing.
Person, get off my lawn.
Right.
So that you call them out by name.
One of the other things is that if we can agree on the idea of unencrypted, free, and open radio communication as being acceptable, even for some people who are more private about their lives, exchanging contact information is a little tenuous, especially if they don't really want to associate with you too much. So sometimes saying, hey, I'm on channel whatever, is simpler than saying, here's my phone number, what's yours? Here's my email, what's yours? We want to get there eventually, but sometimes it's simpler to say, hey, I'm going to be on this frequency. And then, as we mentioned last time, when seconds count, first responders are minutes away, but the person right next to you is already on the scene. So having that kind of relationship with your neighbors, when, say a tree has fallen on top of your vehicle or on your shed or whatever, that person's already there. You don't have to wait for a vehicle to show up. They're there.
So I got
Go ahead.
a point on that, just to add to that. Last year we had some really strong windstorms and a lot of tree branches were taken down. And some of us in my church group went around with chainsaws and said, hey, we'll cut up those branches and pile them up by the side of the road so you guys don't have to worry about them. One particular family we went to and said, hey, we noticed you've got some branches down in your yard. We can chop them up, set them out there, and it'll be fine. And the first thing they asked was, how much?
Mm-hmm.
And we had to explain, we don't want any money, we're just doing it, right?
Right.
And they were, I'm trying to find the right word. Maybe it's bemused by the fact that we were willing to do that. They did accept our help and we took care of them, but yeah, so that there is potentially a barrier to overcome there where people are not used to that type of thing. And so that may be an issue that you have to figure out a way to overcome.
Yeah, some people.
$800 last winter.
Make 900. They weren't
That's right. That's right.
I made enough shoveling snow to pay for my back surgery.
I didn't make a cent if the IRS is listening. So yeah, no, absolutely good point that sometimes neighborly help, we have to overcome this transactional nature, right? And says, well, no, I'm just going to do this for the sake of doing it, right? As Harry Truman says, all will concede that in order to have good neighbors, we must also be good neighbors. Talking about radios, handheld radios for communications on foot around the neighborhood can work, depending on how densely populated your neighborhood is. But if you live in a more rural area, or you've got a ranch, or you live on opposite ends of Wheeler Farm, as Dave was talking about Wheeler Farm, that handheld radio may not be the thing that you're looking to do, because you might actually be on an ATV, motorcycle, or some other vehicle. So a mobile radio might do well for those kinds of things. And we want to consider radio use even when cell phones are still available. So frequently we think about radio use as like this last resort, last ditch. As soon as the cell phones are down, then we go to radios. And you can go to radio before that, long before that. And one of the things to recognize is that a large number of people already have antennas on their roof, right? We talk about like, oh yeah, well, I've got a ham radio antenna on my roof. This kind of sounds crazy, right? Well, look at how many people already have satellite dishes and whatever on their roofs. It's not such a crazy idea. As Joe Rogan mentions, greatness and madness are next door neighbors. So sometimes it's not such a crazy idea to say, hey, you're already willing to have that thing on there and it's kind of ugly. Might as well have an antenna that works for other things too. Let's talk about equipment and capabilities. And here's what I want to drive home, is that what's important is finding what works for you. Now, I'm a big fan of GMRS as a solution, but it is a licensed service, and there are license-free services available, including CB radio and MERS, FRS. There's also Meshtastic, which runs on the 900 megahertz LoRa radios, and there are just regular FM 900 megahertz radios. If you wanted to get really crazy, you could do something with Wi-Fi. I know ICOM has some radios that are Wi-Fi enabled. You can do anything that you want to do, whatever works for you. For the most part, though, trying to keep it simple kind of helps in adoption. We love the technical side of ham radio, but for most people, they want what's simple. I put in here that ham and GMRS are the simplest license services to use, but business licenses are available with frequency coordinator review and et cetera, et cetera. This is a popular solution for those who subscribe to more closed groups like we were talking about earlier. They do like to say set up a repeater with a fixed frequency that they've got their own channel, ranches in Texas or whatever, and that can appeal to some people as well. Personally, I think that the time and expense is probably not too worthwhile, but it's an option that's available, and it doesn't require everyone online to be using call signs once you've got your frequency and all of that set up. But you want to consider options that work for all ages and abilities, and fewer buttons with simpler, larger screens really help. So as an example, we've got some extended family members who suffer from dyslexia. So having a screen where you see 16 or 19 might be difficult, right? But if you have a voice option to announce what channel you're on, you can then announce it's 16 or 19. And now that person can find out even if they can see a screen. Or some folks who are visually impaired may not be able to see a very small screen or see at all. So having options that don't require reading a tiny screen is very useful. For those who are deaf, something like the Meshtastic solution where you're delivering text messages through an offline network might work best for someone like that, right? Because FM radio is not going to do anything for you if you can't hear it. You may also consider different signaling methods using lights or colors or whatever works for you. But it's important to keep in mind that not everyone has the same abilities and faculties or interest in learning the equipment in the same way. So we should keep those options available. We have a little quote here from Mr. Shakespeare himself. Now join your hands, and with your hands, your hearts. So we'll talk about handheld radios first off. And these are prices that I got off of Amazon a week ago or so. And, you know, the options are numerous. these aren't the best radios in the world. Please don't misunderstand. These are options. They're options that don't break the bank. For 50 to 80 bucks, you're in business with a pair of radios if you're talking about GMRS or FRS. And for some options that are not very hard to use, like this Retevis RB26 that I've got at the bottom there, you can get a pack of them, 5-pack for 80 bucks. That's 16 bucks a radio. It's actually cheaper than the bubble pack in Walmart. Those are practically chuckable. And what's amazing about all of these radios that I've shown here is they are all USB-C chargeable. Everyone's got some way of charging via USB. Some of them have fixed antennas, some have removable antennas, some have screens, some don't. But there are options.
So I want to talk about that power option for a second. USB-C chargeable is great, and it's people have readily available the little battery packs to use to charge their phones and whatnot. But a solution that uses AA batteries or AAA batteries might be better for your typical FRS radio user, because you can hand them a radio and a box of batteries, and those batteries will sit on the shelf for 10 years just fine and still be usable. They'll degrade somewhat, but they'll still be very usable. Whereas if it's got an integrated lithium ion battery,
that'll go flat.
A year, it's going to be dead, right? And then when they need it, they're going to have to figure out how to charge it.
Yep.
And so that's something to consider for the technically challenged that you may be dealing with.
Yeah, 100% agree. And for those options that are, AA and AAA, you'll find Motorola has a whole bunch of FRS radios. They tend to be more expensive than what we've got listed here, which is, I think, unfortunate. But it's one of the AA battery compatibility is what drew me to the Baofeng UV5R in the first place when I got into prepping as an idea a few years ago, right? Being able to keep exactly as you said. I've got my battery pack and just a bag of AA batteries. And I know that even if my lithium batteries fail, I can jam those AA's in there and I'm on the air. So 100% agree. Go ahead, Dan.
And this is really a good segue into a discussion that I try to have with all my ward communications specialists when they're talking to their block captains on finding the right radio for them. Every radio has its pros and cons. USB-C is a very good pro for some people. Having the ability to use alkaline batteries is more useful to some other people. Okay, so I think it's important that we educate the people as to the options that are out there and evaluate the pros and cons. One of the main things that I look for in a radio is the ability to receive VHF and UHF handbands, because in a grid down event, I want to get information, and you're not going to get it from an FRS radio. Okay, you're going to get it from people who are on the handbands. And so again, every radio has its pros and cons. It's important that you find one that works for you, but you need to do that with your eyes open.
Yep.
Don't just go in and have your only requirement having a AA battery to charge it up. You need to look at the issue and have a holistic approach, and then make a decision, because that when you buy that, you've lost the ability to do other stuff.
Yep.
So are you willing, where's your compromise at?
Yeah, no, 100% valid. Like these mobile radios, all of them can do GMRS. At least 2 of them can do NOAA, but none of these can listen to the ham bands. But these 2, which it's hilarious to see the same Anytone radio sold by different importers at different prices. And one says it's 20 watts and one says it's 25 watts, and it's the same final MOSFET on there, folks. But these two bottom radios can receive those ham bands and any other frequency in the 2 meter and 70 centimeter. Go ahead, Paul.
Now, I was gonna say, you were talking about USB-C as a +2. I kind of took a different tack. I live in a 55 and better community.
Yes.
And we have a lot of folks who are not tech savvy. Some of them do not have access to a USB-C charger.
Mhm.
The HOA asked me to get some radios for use in a net within the HOA. And I actually selected a radio that has a charger that nothing else will work with, just so it won't get borrowed for a camping trip or whatever. So if you're handing the radio to a non-expert, think about making sure that the radio is always available for its intended purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Having single purpose charging machinery makes it so that it's not going to get stolen for anything else. It's not going to get broken when, somebody comes over to charge their phone or whatever. And you always know, like, hey, my radio needs to go on this cradle. So
But
different
if it gets
considerations.
lost, then they're out of
Then they're
luck.
completely out,
Right.
right?
So that's the other
That's the
side that they
drawback
have
of
to
that.
evaluate. It's a great solution for a problem that you have, but there's also a con. There's a con to every radio that will show,
Yeah.
Well,
So-
the answer there is we have a spare radio that came with a charger for $11.50.
There you go. Yeah.
So we're set there, but yeah, and charging in an emergency is an issue too.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what kind of charger you have, if it has an AC plug on one end.
Right.
My thought is that the batteries will get us through a day.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I have to pull my truck out in the street and use the inverter in the tailgate, we could get an outlet strip and charge 6 radios at a time.
Yep.
There are different ways to approach that.
That's one of the advantages to a USB charging brick like this, right? It's got 5 USB outlets on it. I can plug in one side, plug in 5 radios, charge simultaneously, right? Or in our case, we've got Jackery at home that we can use for small electronic power. And, if you did run out of juice on your radio, you could run it off of that. Another option is battery eliminators, right? You've got the DC 12-volt connection to go instead of the battery pack, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, absolutely. Great discussion. Anything from the folks online, Ragnar or Vern? I haven't been checking the messages.
Can they hear us too?
They can hear us.
You're doing a great job.
Well, thank you.
And we're quietly listening.
Okay. Sounds good.
And I have the chat open, so.
Okay, so you're looking at chat.
If
Great.
anybody says anything, see it.
Fabulous. Thanks, Jen. Preparing for liftoff. All right, cool. We've got equipment. We've got people. Everyone's kitted up. We're all around the helicopter, but why isn't this thing up in the air, right? So,
Because the pilot's standing 10 feet away.
right, the pilot needs to get in the cockpit there. As Mark Twain says, the secret of getting started is breaking your complex, overwhelming tasks into small, manageable tasks and starting on the first one. And I like that he used complex and overwhelming. That really drives home the point.
And I like that he said starting, because breaking it up into tasks is great, but if you don't ever start.
If you never start, you
Yeah.
don't get there, right? And so one of the first things that we tend to worry about is the radio, but one of the first things to really worry about is the roster. Who is part of our group? We need an initial group. It needs to be more than just me, and it's fewer than everyone else in the neighborhood, right? We need a meeting schedule. If we don't meet, we don't start. We do need configured equipment. Telling everyone to buy a Baofeng UV5R and never programming it, well, you won't get very far doing that, right? So having configured equipment is important, and frequently the first meeting will be bring whatever you've bought off of Amazon, and hopefully it's still within the return window in case you bought the wrong thing. A channel plan. Like we talked about earlier, we had the radio. It was configured. we had the right person there and we couldn't make the contact, right? So having a channel plan clearly described, in the case that we're in an emergency, we're going to go to this channel, etc. Having a net control script, what do we say? Just like we mentioned earlier, in emergency communications, having some familiar structure to fall back on will help. In this case, the net control script doesn't have to be nearly as fancy or complex as our club Sunday night script is, right? This can be really, really simple. Radio cheat sheets. Again, just like we talked about earlier. In an emergency, am I going to flip out, this little, manual written in very interesting English, if you can call it that, in size 0.6 font? No, I'm going to toss that aside. So having some sort of a clear cheat sheet is way, way better. An area map with a rally point. And I've got asterisks next to these because these will require some work, effort, and coordination. Depends on where you live, what you're doing, etc. If you live in an apartment building, the rally point might not be hard to describe. It's just the entrance to the community or whatever, fine. But if you live in a more rural environment, or there's a park or whatever, having a map to describe where you're going to meet, if you do have a community meet, is an important thing. But the most important thing is to practice, of course. Even the best plan with the best equipment and the most motivated members, if you don't practice, you just don't get there. The power of radio is not that it speaks to millions, but that it speaks intimately and privately to each one of those millions. So radio as a broadcast mechanism is very different than a phone call. And when we structure our net control script, we want to make sure that even if those people that we know are listening, there might be other people who we don't know who are listening. I'm in the process of trying to get our congregation up and running with an emergency radio net. And so part of that is preparing a net control script. And what you see here is a draft of mine. And I've included some instructions for whoever is net control. Listen for the frequency to be in use or not, or available before you start your net. And then give a warning that says, we're going to start our net in a minute. And then clearly define what you're doing. Sometimes we talk about ERC, but we don't actually define that that means an emergency response communications network. So we have that clearly defined, calling the South Cottonwood Ward Emergency Response Communication Network. And then you announce your schedule. In this case, I've made the assumption that we meet every Sunday at 4 p.m. It might be every third Thursday of the month, or whatever it is, whatever your group decides on. You also want to announce who you are clearly. My name is, and I will be net control for today. And I have instructions here because this is meant to be on a GMRS FRS net. I have instructions that if you have a GMRS call sign, give your GMRS call sign. And we also give the rules of engagement, if you will. This is a directed net. We know what that means, but people who are listening who are not ham radio operators might have no idea what a directed net is. So we describe it. Wait for me to call on you before transmitting. When responding with a comment, say your name or call sign once and wait to be called on. Well, why do we do that? Well, we can't see each other. We got to wait for it to be acknowledged somehow, right? It's like raising your hand. This net is expected to last about 10 minutes and will break for urgent traffic. Well, what if you're not a radio operator and you want to break in? Now we got to give them instructions. Say break during a pause and wait to be called on and to break in with your urgent traffic, right? And then we announce what we're going to do next. We're going to call the roster of our known group members, and then we're going to call for missed or late check-ins. And then finally, we look for new and visitor check-ins. And if you are a new visitor, I'll ask you if you want to join our group. We want to be friendly. We want to extend the invitation. There are some people that you may arrive at their doorstep and, maybe it was a bad day, maybe all sorts of things. But maybe they did end up getting a radio and did start listening. And you want to let them know they're able to join the group no matter what. And then we want to give instructions for folks on how to route the traffic and the announcements items during a net. And this is important because, again, as ham radio operators, we're used to it, but people who aren't. So I give here instructions on how to do that. And then thank you for joining the net today. When phone service is down or during an emergency, group members should check in on this channel hourly from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or whatever cadence that you would like to select. I'm not going to tell you it has to be wilderness protocol or whatever. There are lots of good options available and lots of good reasons to follow those options. The important thing is that it's clearly communicated to members of the group what it is that you're going to do and why. I have also added on here the NATO phonetic alphabet. You and I know it forwards and backwards and upside down, but many people may not. And most importantly, in an emergency, people forget even their own name. I think I've told the story before that the second time that I joined the GMRS net with Sherwood, he's the one that introduced me to this concept, I actually forgot my call sign halfway through giving it. This is Whiskey Romeo. And if it was a phone, I would have hung up, right? And so you want to give them a reference. You want to give them a lifeline. So here's the NATO phonetic alphabet. If anyone's interested in this, I can send them the Word document, no problem. Here's a quote from Sandra Cisneros: "The most powerful speaking you can do is the speaking that comes from your heart and your love." So now we want to fashion a community plan. Well, before you do that, you got to fashion a family plan, because the community plan will look very similar to a family plan. So this plan here is courtesy of Kevin Westenskow, KB7SNA, and I've redacted some things and moved it around, but he's got some interesting things. He's got a meeting place clearly listed, primary and secondary. He's got clear instructions on how to make contact. Pull out the radio from the kit. Don't change anything, just turn it on, right? And then he's got try to make contact twice every 15 minutes on the 0, 15, 30, and 45. And leave the radio on listening in between. Why? Clock drift. My clock, my Fitbit might say it's 12:01 and yours might say it's 12:03. So if I get on exactly at 12 o'clock, I might miss you and you might miss me. But if you're listening in between, you'll catch each other eventually. He also has listed here his GMRS, FRS, and ham radio configurations. It looks like he's got a tiered form of communication for GMRS in and around the neighborhood, FRS at a campsite, and ham radio everywhere else. Again, do whatever you like, but there's a good example of something that looks like it can be feasible and it's approachable. Now we'll talk about cheat sheets. Forget about shortcuts. Instead, enjoy the wonders of your path. And that's great unless your house is on fire. And then I just really want the shortcut, right? So I talked about the Retevis RB26 earlier. This is a radio that I've actually purchased and dispersed amongst my in-laws. And one of the reasons for that is that it's a very simple, easy to use radio, and it looks and feels like an FRS radio. And factually, it's not all that much more powerful than FRS radios. So there's very little that you can do to get yourself in trouble. But rather than reading the manual, I've printed up just a quick little card that looks exactly like this. This is just at a glance, here are all the features. Now, I mentioned the UV5R earlier, and I have a much more complex cheat sheet for that. It starts to border on not that much better than the manual, really, once you look at the type size 8 font that I've used for all of the functions. So an example of what's probably not the most optimal cheat sheet here, but one that I've prepared nonetheless.
So in your opinion, on the cheat sheet, would it be better to have it on one page or to have all of the information easily readable? What's your take on that?
So on my cheat sheets, I should have brought them actually physically. But the one cheat sheet is one-sided, and it is just the radio information. The other one, the more complex one that I showed you, is a full 8.5 by 11 folded in half, and on the other side, on the back side of that sheet, is the frequency list of what's programmed on the radio. So personally, I think for neighborhood network communications like this, you probably want to err on the the side of simpler is better. Yeah. But for my own radios, I want to remember what I've got programmed on there. And sometimes I remember, yeah, channel 32 has this, but I don't remember what the tone was for Ensign Peak. So having it listed on a cheat sheet is very useful. And that's where printing out the standard load and things like that is much more powerful for us. So our roles and responsibilities as a mentor. I have firefighters here, and they're hosing down something. I think that something is probably someone learning about radio for the first time.
And they're hosed.
Right, they are hosed. So frequently, in our excitement to try to explain why radio is really cool, we go way far off into left field, way too quickly, and people get that deer in the headlights look like, whoa, what's going on here? So what can we do to be better mentors? The worst mistake a leader can do is to mentor no one, choose no successor, and leave no legacy. So one of the first things that we want to do is we do want to write something, because when we talk to someone, they're going to remember maybe like 10 to 20%, if they're smart, 30% of what we told them. But if you have it written down, they can review it later and remember. And it's got to be an approachable amount. 2 or 3 pages is an appropriately approachable amount for introducing the subject. Is it the totality of the subject? Absolutely not. But it's enough to get people started. Allow for questions, discussion, and changes to the documents as needed. Ultimately, the documents are for the people that you're handing them to. If they don't get it or it doesn't work for them, change it until it does. It doesn't matter that I like to list the RX frequency first and then the TX frequency. If that doesn't make sense to anybody else in my neighborhood, then I need to change it until it makes sense to everybody else, because I'm okay. It doesn't matter if, they're asking basic questions like, wait, can I radio someone all the way in Kansas with my handheld? Field the question until we get some understanding. Focus on concepts and skills that make radio a useful tool. And we want to emphasize that the radio is just a tool. What we actually want to do is coordinate and communicate together. The radio itself doesn't matter. As much as we like to talk about the radios, most people don't. A good group plan will work even if key people are out of town or busy. And so that's the other thing. If we have structured something that only works when we're around and falls apart the minute that we're out of town, what's going to happen during an emergency when we really need it is going to fall apart. Have something to say and say it as clearly as you can. That is the only secret. So part of doing this mentoring, especially in putting together a community plan, is spending some quality time writing and rewriting things. That net control script that I showed you, I've been through several revisions of it. It's not that I don't know what a net control script looks like. We all can very helpfully go to Jan's website and download the net control script that we use. But I've written it and rewritten it until it can be simple to teach to non-radio operators.
Our net control script has changed dramatically since the beginning of the club as well. So, it is a work in progress.
It's a living document.
It's a living document. It's a living document. And so there are some things that happen, right? Frequently when we sit down to write, we will write differently than we speak. And what comes out of the keyboard is this really stilted, officious kind of sounding thing. through no fault of our own, because we've all spent way too much time reading textbooks, right? And so distilling that back down into basic concepts, simple, easy to speak sentences is work. And I'm just acknowledging that here with this typewriter graphic.
And that typewriter is the same model I use learning the typewriter in school. It's not far from the truth.
I learned with Mavis Beacon teaches typing, right? So
Hey, mine was, that one looks totally different from the manual ones I looked at.
yeah.
Ours was they were very.
We must have been special. We had IBM selectors.
Well,
Oh,
no,
man.
we had to learn on a manual
Manual.
and the IBM selector. The manual was close to that.
Well, part of the other things that we do as mentors is to coach. And here we have a coach showing the direction in which they should kick the ball. And that sounds like, really, we have to teach that? Yeah, you do. And some of the stuff that we're going to have to teach has to become second nature to people. You don't win games as a coach during games. You win games as a coach before games. And that's the truth. If your players don't know what to do, they're not going to suddenly remember that you taught them X, Y, Z when they're on the field, right? You have to practice, practice, practice. So explain the basic concepts and principles frequently, because the group will grow and shrink. Some of your neighbors may drop out. Some of them may come in. Then sometimes life gets busy and in the way. So you'll have to explain some of that very frequently. Experienced members may teach the basics to new members as a way to build the coaching mindset. We got to teach how to teach. We got to train the trainer. Discuss lessons learned when things don't go as planned. Giving criticisms and feedback is hard. And we got to do it in a way that people don't feel like we're taking ourselves too seriously, but they still got to learn from it.
And if you gotta say something that would make someone feel like an idiot, don't do it on the net.
Yes, if you feel like it might be better to do it privately, do it privately.
Praise publicly, criticize privately.
That's right. It takes time and effort to teach everyone who is willing to learn, and to provide experience for everyone who is willing to teach. And it's important to look at both aspects of that. I think frequently it's easy to focus on just the teaching aspect, but we also have to mentor other people to become mentors. Go ahead, Dan.
I just want to continue on with what Paul and Jan said. We talk about criticizing and when to criticize. It's just as important to give praise to the people who are doing their thing, whatever that is. That carries more weight than constructive criticism, and they'll listen to your criticism
if you have that relationship built.
Yep.
Right. No, I listened to the Sunday Net a couple times before actually joining the club. And one of the things that I noticed immediately was N7XDL, this is KJ7RPV. Go ahead, KJ7RPV. Dan, this is Brad. Just wanted to give you a public attaboy, right? And he does it faithfully, and it builds our club in a meaningful way. That kind of interaction is something that is worth teaching and reteaching in our communities.
I think it goes kind of hand in hand with that observation that I'm not aware of another club in the Valley that has the expectation that if you're on the roster, your turn will come to be net control.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot more opportunities for that positive reinforcement after it's over. But I think that's a wonderful thing. I've mentioned that to a couple other clubs, and they get this like ghastly white face hanging, oh, we don't have more than 2 or 3 people that do that.
We
Right.
made that decision early that everybody needed to learn how to do it.
Yeah.
Dan gave the classes on how to do that.
The best way to learn how to do it is to be forced to actually do it.
Yes.
Oh, I would never want to be net control on Utah VHF Society with like 5 people checking in all at once. That sounds crazy, right? That's very intimidating.
It's actually a lot of fun.
The VHF Society one's a lot easier to check in than the races.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't listened to that one yet.
The VHS Society net's kind of odd anyway. My wife laughs every time she hears it come on because she knows I'm gonna sit there for an hour, wait to check in, and then nothing will happen.
Uh-huh.
And she goes, why do you do that?
All the action's up front when someone's got some equipment to sell, right?
And that's done right up front.
Yep, yep. We don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. Train the way you fight, fight the way you train. We also have the expectation as the initial team captain to lead by example. I'm the captain of my destiny. I do not abandon the ship in hard times, but I do have sense enough not to go down with the ship. And exactly as we're talking about, rotate net control to build confidence in the group members. Offer to practice one-on-one with new operators or to help configure and troubleshoot new antennas and radios. My wife's here in the back. She, on her first time doing net control on our GMRS net, she and I practiced together, and it wasn't transmitting anything, but we grabbed the radios and we clicked the button to practice holding the PTT while you're speaking and letting off the PTT after you're done so you can hear somebody else, right? And some of that just needs to be trained and practiced one-on-one. It can't always be done entirely on the air. Teach and model relaying during simplex operation if two stations cannot hear each other. This is an important thing, especially since as amateur radio operators, we're very, very accustomed to using repeaters for almost everything that we do. And your neighborhood comms are going to be simplex. Simplex is tough. Just because I can hear everyone else doesn't mean that everyone else can necessarily hear me, right? And so teach and model how to relay and resist the urge to do it all yourself. Frequently, we key up a lot faster than most people, right? And especially once we get comfortable, we can, I talk to Sherwood frequently enough. I know when he's about to let go. I'm keying up as he's letting go, right? But you got to give some space. And sometimes it means an awkward moment or two while you wait for someone to say relay.
One of the things if you do net controller to speaking, very, like take a breath, you have to remember to take a breath.
Mm-hmm.
Or listen for the beep on the repeater, right?
That's right. That's right. You gotta listen for the beep or take a breath and just wait for the carrier to drop, all these other things. Again, fear defeats more people than anything else, any other one thing in the world. Keying up on the microphone is scary. All right, we also got to play the role of professor a little bit, teach the concepts. Nothing is more practical than a good theory. Sometimes people say, why do I need to know the theoretical, right? Doesn't it just work? Show works better than tell in many cases. You can talk about antenna polarization until you're blue in the face, and the average person can grab the radio and go like this. For whatever reason, people hold it sideways. I don't know why. I don't know how they learn it. I don't know where they learn it. But we must teach them to unlearn what they have learned.
It's too much Hollywood,
Right. Right. It's gangster. You got to hold it sideways to,
Or they're used to using their phone.
Right.
And they got the microphone.
We got to hold
Up here.
Right.
Right. They're not used to the
look cool because it looks real cool on TV doing that,
right. Dan, I don't know why, but I've seen that and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Who teaches holding it upside down to transmit? I don't know, but we have to help them learn that. We'll review concepts as needed, but not without context. Don't go into talking about line loss if nobody's running line anywhere, right? And sometimes if it's a short enough run, it just doesn't matter if it's RG8X or RG58. It doesn't have to, everything doesn't have to be LMR 400.
600.
Oh, big spender.
Helium. Something.
Oof. Yeah, you can't afford it, right? You gotta pay per foot there. Define terms and acronyms when you use them. Frequently, we'll talk about handheld radio as an HT, and nobody has any idea what we're talking about. So be prepared to slow down a little bit and explain, what do you mean by tone? What do you mean by offset? What do you mean by this, that, and the other?
And let me tell you something, that is the trick on teaching people who don't know anything about radios. You know, this is their first experience. I always go to my wife, who is the poster child of non-technical. Okay, and I'll do my presentation to her or let her read it, and she'll say, what the heck is a CTCSS?
Right.
Where I didn't explain it, you know, we use terms all the time and it's second nature to us. It's a language and we don't think that other people don't know our language, you know, and so it's a very big deal.
Yep. And then this last point here is, don't assume knowledge about radio, even if these people in your neighborhood have worked in an environment where the radio has been a part of their issued equipment, right? So these are people who might have worked in law enforcement or emergency medical services, or in public works or construction, military. Just because they were issued a radio doesn't mean that they know everything about radio. And it also doesn't mean that they'll feel comfortable asking questions either. In fact, some people might ask them to field questions instead of us because, well, he or she carried a gun and a radio on the hip, so therefore that person must know everything about equipment. Well, they also drove a car for a living, and I assure you they don't know how everything in that transmission works either, right? So we want to avoid people feeling like they've been put on the spot. We want people to feel comfortable in their own skin and comfortable as members of the group. And we certainly don't want to invite people to then feel like, oh, well, I have to defend why I don't know anything about radio. It doesn't matter. So don't assume knowledge, and don't assume that those who do know will immediately speak up. You're going to have to suss that out a little bit in your group. Now I've got a 3-minute example here of an ERC net. Again, this is a net that we participate in every Sunday. In this instance, this is a recording from January. My wife as net control, her first time as net control. And in this case, we have fictionalized the addresses of the radio operators, but I want to show where everyone is transmitting from roughly in terms of distance to give an idea of what simplex sounds like when you have to go around the neighborhood.
Calling the Board ERC net. This net meets every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. local time on the GMRS FRS radio channel 16. Net control for.
I meant to click to mute, and then apparently that killed the transmission. So net control for today is Bethany, and we've redacted last names, the name of the unit, and the call signs, but this gives you an idea of what the intro preamble can be for a net control script. Oh, why is this not? I guess. Go ahead.
Do you use last names in your real net?
Yes, we do.
Okay, I would suggest against that, but okay.
I can look up my call sign.
Right.
Well, the FRS people have a little more privacy in that regard, but one of the things we've stressed in our HOA net, or I've stressed, is that we don't say the name of the development, we don't say last names, and we actually have a system where each of the block captains refers to the homes in their area by their zone number and then the last 2 digits of the street address.
Okay.
So it's a 3-digit identifier that's not the address. And I only do that because if we ever have to share information like, yeah, the earthquake is damaged, 806, and we can't lock the doors.
Right.
We don't want that.
To let everyone know
Yeah.
that house is open.
And we don't say Bingham Point because frankly, we don't want to, there will be people out there with bad intent if things really go south.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Not ones that I'd actually personally considered. I've never cared about transmitting my last name. I figure I transmit my call sign, and that's on the internet. Literally anyone can type it.
Another reason is it gives them training, so when they start getting into GMRS and ham radio, then they're already used to not using the last name or, personal identifying information.
The one other thing that jumped out at me when you first showed me your script too was when you said calling the blank ward ERCnet.
Yes.
I kind of do a dance sometimes because my HOA constitutes a quarter of my ward, but it's not a church net. It's the
Right.
HOA's complete initiative. And I kind of like that in a way because we have actually had people stumble across us and check in as guests. And I'm not sure that would have seemed as open if it sounded like a ward function.
Yeah, I mean, we don't actually belong to this ward that we participate in.
Oh, okay.
Well,
I mean, for somebody who doesn't belong to the church at all, if you just called it the Cottonwood,
yeah,
within the Cottonwood ward.
absolutely. Yeah. All good feedback.
These are constructive.
Yeah.
Love credit.
For today is Bethany.
And they're not on the air.
And they're not the.
They're not on the air. It's not on the air. Let's see.
First, I'll call the roll of those in this ward. I'll then ask for any late, missed, or visitor check-ins. Please reply by saying, "This is," followed by your first name, and with your call sign if you have one, and indicate if you have any announcements or other traffic for the net. Blaine. Thanks so much, Blaine. Jill. Okay, nothing from Jill. Nate.
This is Nate checking in. I can also check in for Jill.
Okay, so what I wanted to demonstrate here is that we have a member of the net who, because of geography and whatever, the signal is pretty weak, pretty marginal at best most times that we have the net. And it's really difficult to make out transmissions from this person. However, because we have practiced, I can recognize his voice and call sign even with that much hiss and buzz on the line. The other thing that we have on there is, calling in for someone and then having a family member check in when that person is absent. In a community net, unlike on the ham net, right, we may have someone who usually participates but doesn't have a radio presently, but is there in the house or is present and accounted for. And we want to have that mechanism where we can account for other family members, say, yes, I'm here, so-and-so's here, we're safe, we're good, everyone's happy. Go ahead, Dan.
In today's net, it was a simplex net. Did anybody hear Sam the first time he transmitted? Yes. When I was doing a call out?
Yes.
You heard him the first time?
Yeah.
I could not hear anything. I knew he was transmitting and enough of his tone came out. I didn't understand a word that he said,
But you knew who it
but I
was.
knew it was Sam. And so that's why I said what I said. And I can't remember what I said, but it's, I know it's Sam.
And actually, I didn't hear the first part. I heard like MLL Sam. The first part was cut off. It was pretty staticky from where I was at.
Yeah.
But, I've got an antenna up above the roof that I was using. So wherever
I was
he
parked in my car.
wherever he was, I didn't have limitations.
Yeah.
Of being behind a building or something.
So my point is, just by doing these check-ins, you can be involved with a lot of weeds, a lot of QRM, a lot of everything that, how did you know it was Sam? Well, because I just knew that was Sam's tone.
There's a rhythm.
And I didn't hear, I could not understand a word that he said.
Right.
There's a rhythm to it, the way he talks.
Mhm.
That's all you hear.
I do the same thing with Sam on the 10-meter net. Some weeks we just can't pull him out, but I know
Yep.
what he sounds like.
Right,
Exactly.
right. Yeah, when I talk to Sherwood, he doesn't even have to, he gets the kilo fox and I know it's him, right?
He has a unique tone about
He
it.
has his cadence, he has the way he sings his call, and that's the value in practicing, right? Because even when I can't exactly make out what the other station is saying, I can know that the other person is up. And in an emergency, that's what I need to know. I need to know that you're up.
But I think practicing the relay is important
Mhm.
too. Very often that's gonna be, especially in simplex. Relay's gonna be involved.
Yeah,
I can check in for Jill would be a little vague to me if I didn't know them. Because I'm not sure if that's a relay or whether
Or a husband and wife.
or a husband and wife and Jill's out of town and
right.
check me in.
Yeah, and in this case, this is family members, and we know that the other person was there.
In
Because
context, they redacted Jill's
Last name,
which
right.
is probably the last name of Nate,
Mhm.
right?
So
One of those ones some of those ones you do know it's husband and wife.
mhm.
There was it, Kelly and Doris both checked in.
Yeah,
And a lot of times, what happens if that one spouse has never checked in? Do they know how to run the equipment?
right.
Yeah, at some point you need to, you may lose track of who's falling behind on training or currency, because if someone else always checks them in, they're not getting the practice.
And that's something that we have worked on as a couple on a number of occasions. The first few times that we joined the net, I'd set up the radio and whatever and get everything going. And then at some point it was like, okay, Bethany, here's what I'm doing. And then I'd undo it, and then she did it.
No, I showed you.
Right. And then the next time you showed me how it was done, right? And that's how we reinforce this skill so that everyone knows how to operate the radios at home. Absolutely.
We hear that a lot on some of the 2-meter and 70-centimeter nets. When husband and wife are licensing, you never hear the wife check in.
Yeah.
And to me, is that really a check-in? Because if the purpose of the net is to keep you familiar with your radio,
Right.
that kind of concerns me a little
The
bit.
purpose of the net is to check in. And if you're not checking in, are you checked in? That's a question I always ask when someone checks in their spouse. Well, I'll mark you down, but she didn't, or he didn't check in,
Right.
Well, on the
So,
10-meter net roster, I just respond, okay, thank you for the honorary check-in, and I don't put them down because I want to know,
Who's actually
looking back through the spreadsheet, what the actual numbers were and how many people were there that week. And
but they need to know that you're not marking them down.
well, they do.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
Okay,
Um,
excellent.
The other thing I noticed the last couple of weeks is staticky. And I think sometimes it's like,
For what?
not for like the Taylorsville group and
Well, the 2-meter side of the repeater's got antenna damage. Because
it is,
it's not happening to anyone checking in on 70 centimeters. It's only the people checking in on
no,
2
2
meters.
meters. And it says checking in, you learn to something like that, it's like checking in often.
Oh, yeah.
We figure out, okay, if there's a problem with a lot of people, what's going on? And if the other person doesn't check in, they might not know, if there's a problem.
Yep.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, what we actually had on this net, and I've clipped it out, is on this net, we had someone with a very low power FRS trying to check in, and it was not possible to hear this person clearly. And Bethany had to rely on Sherwood to relay what was going on there. And that person still continued to try to contact and comment on the net, and it created a situation where we couldn't hear, net control couldn't hear this station, but someone else was relaying what this person was saying.
Perfect. Thank you, Nate. Next, Roger.
This is Whiskey Red.
Perfect. Thank you, Nate. Perfect. Thank you, Nate. Next, Roger.
This is Whiskey Red.
Perfect. Thank you. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, Nate.
No.
Next, Roger.
This is Whiskey.
Help you with this.
I don't know what's going on with that slide. I was just trying to pause it. In any case,
This completes the Ward ERC.
so we'll skip through the rest of that to this.
In case of an
closing.
emergency, you should monitor this frequency from approximately 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. or as long as regular phone service is unavailable. The first person checking in will act as net control until the Ward ERC specialist checks in. We acknowledge and thank you for your service. This is Bethany, call sign WR, returning this frequency to normal use.
And so this is what I wanted to get to, as well as we need to teach that when we're running the net, we're occupying this frequency, right? It actually keeps it busy from other people who can use it. And at the end of our amateur net, you know, we do acknowledge that thank you for the other operators for standing by and all of this stuff. And part of it is helping folks to realize that radio is a broadcast mechanism. We're using up this channel. Everyone else who can hear us can't actively transmit or use it while we're doing the net. So helping them acknowledge that and close the net with returning the channel or frequency back to normal use, or however you want to say that you're clear, is just something that's good and helpful to teach others to practice. All right, so what do we do now? We got to start planning now. And there are many resources available on ready.gov and the Salt Lake County Emergency Management website. And they have taken much of what's on ready.gov and presented it in slightly different format on the SL County Emergency Management site.
So has anybody else noticed that the Salt Lake County Emergency Management.org is like, I swear they're running it on a hamster or something.
It is
so
slow.
Slow.
It's slow. And so these screenshots here I've taken from ready.gov because I like the style of the ready.gov, and there's a couple of other resources that they link to, but both websites are wonderful resources to look at, and they give you a website step-by-step plan on how to put together an emergency plan for your family. And say, consider specific needs in your household. Some of these are different ages of people within your household, and that includes folks with disabilities or other special needs. If you have someone who's in a wheelchair or uses a walker or a cane or crutches, that means that that person is not going to be able to use their hands as readily. Or if there's someone that you need to carry, it means you're not going to be able to use your hands as readily, right? And so part of your planning needs to take that into account. And they have here a very useful form that you can fill out and print the PDF or email it to yourself and just paste it, you know, in a clear location, either on your fridge or whatever. This is our family emergency plan, and step 4 is to practice. I think the community plan starts with each person preparing a household plan in your community. And your community plan then starts to look very similar to what many of the people around you have as their household plan as well, or vice versa. And also, if you have a plan that you can share with the person next to you, it helps jumpstart them. Make a plan by location. Go ahead, Dave.
People have to realize there is a difference between a companion pet and a service pet.
Mm-hmm.
Service pet actually is for medical attention.
Right.
Alert.
Yeah, not all animals are trained in the same way for the same thing. A seeing eye dog wouldn't do very well for someone suffering from seizures. So if you have a companion animal for someone who suffers from seizures, that person needs to have that animal accessible to them as well, right?
And document.
Yep.
You know, there are a lot of places that can be used as shelters, but will not take pets.
Right. If you have a service animal that is documented and this is the purpose of the animal, that animal goes with you everywhere.
And unfortunately, too many people have used the service animal thing, and so now it's requiring formal documentation.
Yep. One of the other things that we need to do is plan by location, right? As we talked earlier, you're not always going to be at home when things happen. Sometimes you're going to be at work or at the community center or at Gold's Gym or wherever, right? And so pick just a couple of the places that you're most frequently found at. You know, if I'm most frequently found at Little Caesars, then maybe I need to make a plan for what I'm doing if I'm picking up pizza at Little Caesars.
I'll be at Woody's.
Right, Woody's for Dan. We know where you hang out. For neighborhoods, condos, and apartments, talk to your neighbors, figure out how you can work together, decide who will check on elderly or disabled neighbors. And this is the other thing. Sometimes people live alone. Sometimes people live alone and they're limited in mobility. So we need to make sure that somebody remembers to check on them. I'd heard a story once about someone who woke up and noticed a kind of sooty smell in the air. And it turns out that the fire alarms had gone off overnight and the unit 2 doors down had been ablaze and no one had woken up this person from sleep. It's like, well, everyone else evacuated. And the question was, why didn't you wake me when you left the house? To the roommates. Oh, well, we thought you heard it, right? We need to make sure that we don't leave people behind. So all this information is available on ready.gov and the Salt Lake County Emergency Management website. And that's the end of the presentation. I think that there's a lot of information to digest, a lot of things to take a look at, but the big takeaway for us as ham radio operators is that our function in trying to get these community plans up and running is that of teacher, mentor, and team lead and captain, and kind of fielding a lot of these questions that might come up, or a lot of the confusion that might happen as people step into the realm of preparedness, right? So it matters a lot less what technology you use, as long as everyone's on the same page on what technology you are using as a group. Like I said, in our group, we use GMRS. It's simple. I'm licensed. My wife uses the same call sign. She doesn't have to worry about any sort of particular programming or settings. The radios are always set to channel 16, which we use. So you just turn it on and talk away. There are definitely drawbacks to it, though, and GMRS, as UHF goes, is not quite as long distance. So if we lived in a larger community or in more rural areas, we might want something with a little more reach. But yeah, that's it for the presentation. Are there any other questions or comments that we'd like to make?
So this emergency plan and the net are based on a ward, but not your ward?
That's correct.
Okay. I'm just curious about, does your ward have one too?
No. So the net control script that I showed earlier is my attempt at trying to get one started in our ward.
Okay.
Yeah.
So far, not a lot of interest.
It's been difficult. It's been difficult to get ours off the ground, and I can share some of that difficulty because for many people, preparedness has a checklist mentality. It's like building a 72-hour kit. You buy this, check, you put it in the bag, check, and we're done. And
they think they're prepared.
Right. And so the emphasizing that, like, well, we need to pull this out, we need to make sure that it's charged, we need to make sure that it's accessible, that we practice with it, that we know how to use it. It's difficult to overcome the checklist mentality because it's literally how we treat many of the other basic forms of preparedness. You buy certain food and you put it on the shelf in the shed or the garage or the basement and check that off the box. Right. And so it appears to work for so many other aspects of preparedness that this idea of getting together regularly and practicing sounds unnecessary. And that is difficult to overcome. The other thing is the idea of how you hold the antenna and where you're transmitting from matters, right? And some people like to sit in their lazy boy in the middle of the house. And it's like, well, no, if you've got a second story to your building, go up there, transmit from a window. If you know that in our case, we live east of most of the people in our net. So we transmit from the west side of our house to try to reach them, right? But you can't teach that until you start practicing, because it just sounds too theoretical, right? And so that's the struggle that we've been having in our personal community. So
one of the things that I've observed, especially in the lead up to the shakeout, is that our modern communication systems have become so reliable and are so taken for granted that, and they're so good. I mean, the reliability is very, very good. But the more reliable something is, the less you practice for when it's not there. So is it really more reliable? You know, I mean, as a whole system. The Utah Communications Authority is about to redo the repeaters for not every public service agency, but police, fire, and EMS statewide. And it's going to be linked by Ethernet with 144 sites. There seems to be an attitude pervading these agencies now that, oh, this is state of the art. You know, they've just been come out of a presentation from a Harris sales rep who sold them on how this thing is bulletproof. And at the same time this is happening, I'm hearing from some of the clubs that in the handoff of emergency communications from a dedicated position in city government to someone in the fire department, there's a lot of attention not being paid to it anymore. I mean, they want the budget that comes with that assignment, but they don't want the extra workload. And I just see a lot of things kind of converging to where this is going to be a big deal. I mean, potentially is going to be a big deal. We're going to have, just like everything else that we get from a city or a county, we're going to have to do this for ourselves in the big one. There's not going to be a way to text necessarily,
right? Right. And many of the folks kind of rely on GroupMe or other kind of, or Zello or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or what have you. And that all runs on the internet. And everyone's like, oh, well, you know, the internet, it's fine. It's always there. I'm like, wow, you must not be a Comcast subscriber, because let me tell you what, the internet goes down 2 and 3 times a week, guaranteed, right? And talk about patching things together with Ethernet. You think that's bulletproof until the first time that you've got to go into a data center to unrack a network switch that's failed on you, or figure out which of the 58 kajillion Ethernet cables are in there that one of them is just slightly broken.
Or till an earthquake cuts the one coming into the building.
Bingo.
Fiber gets hit by a dude with a backhoe.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah.
Transatlantic fiber down. Yep.
Right?
All you gotta ask is, where do they come with the name Comcast? Well, it's obvious. They cast, if you go with Comcast, you can just cast your comms goodbye.
That's right.
Because that goes bye-bye.
But it's difficult to defeat this idea of, well, my phone has never failed in 50 years. Why should I worry about that now? Well, guess what? Doesn't matter who you subscribe to, everyone's got this cell phone tower over here that serves your community. And if that cell phone tower goes offline for whatever variety of reasons, I don't care who your wireless carrier is, you don't have cell phone anymore.
It doesn't matter if the cell phone tower is up. If you're not on a list, you're not, the cell phone towers can be good, but all ISPs, when the big one hits, when there's a massive grid down event, guess what they do? They pull a switch and they say, these are the people that can get through. And if you're not on that white list, you will see that you have signal, but you will not get dial tone. You will not be able to dial out or receive calls.
Right.
You know, it's where I was going to go with that at some point was that that whole pervasive, it can't fail Titanic mentality, in combination with some things the church went through in years past, where for legal reasons, they were discouraged from integrating ham radio into what the church emergency plan is. That resulted in a kind of baby thrown out with the bathwater thing now, where it's very hard to get boards, bishops and stake presidents on board with even thinking about this. And it's been going on for quite a while. I was living in Florida 30 years ago when they said, no, we don't need ham radio, we'll get cell phones. And a hurricane came through. And they had to learn it the hard way, and they had this pile of yellow t-shirts and no way to call people to put them on.
Right. Or there's this mentality of, well, there's a plan and it's locked away in a shed or an office somewhere. And there's a box of radios that we purchased in 1990, whatever, and it's locked away in that shed as well. And when the big one comes, so-and-so is going to break the window or unlock the door and take that box of radios. And I'm like, and do what? Walk on foot back and forth across the entire neighborhood until everybody has been, at that point, you don't need the radio anymore. You could have done it with paper cup and string, right?
Well, the important part too, radios are getting so common now, especially if you're on an FRS, GMRS, that, if Walmart's fallen down because of the earthquake, you can look on the ground for a blister pack and have two radios.
That's right.
But the more important component of it is, who are you going to call on what channel and say what?
Right.
And that's the stuff that hopefully we get through practice.
That's exactly right. I want to reach someone that I know is close by, that I know has good intent, that I know I can work with, and that I know can be useful to me. And when I grab the radio, I have to be able to express those things in a way that the other person can understand my status, my need, and my position, right? And being able to establish it by practicing with the other people in your community is the most important thing.
Well, and I'm trying to work now on something that's kind of on the level of, if we have a widespread outage, earthquake, super volcano, or whatever, some things that can happen in the West could knock out the grids for a 100-mile radius. I'm trying to get to a point where I know, okay, I've got 4 hours of laptop battery. I've got the battery that will power my HF radio. Where can I get a WinLink node in Colorado or in, New Mexico or Idaho? So it's not always just about your neighborhood. Some parts of the emergency plan are notifying a family member out of state is something we're all told to do. So there's that side of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, you can build out and, my folks live back on the East Coast. I'd love to have some ability to communicate with them. And I did have,
just let them know that you're alive.
that I'm alive, right? And the opposite has been true for me as well. During my freshman year at BYU, September 11th happened. And at the time, my father happened to work at the World Trade Center. During that time, phone service to the East Coast was nearly impossible because everyone else was so busy calling each other around here, horrified, shocked, whatever. It wasn't for, till the next day that I heard back about my dad. And I didn't actually hear, his voice for a few more days after that. Go ahead, Dan.
You know that there's this safe and well form from the Red Cross that will take care of that.
We've got what, 200 of those in the JIT kit? Is that what I was reading in the?
Well, no, there's
The-
a safe and well kit. There's a PDF version on the software where you can go ahead and, if you have a laptop, you can do it that way. And this is the stuff that we then transmit to Las Vegas and Washington using HF WinLink to download. This is the stuff that everybody should be filling out in the neighborhoods. So that your family, and they need to know that they can go to the Red Cross and click on the safe and well, how is my family? There's a mechanism already set up. Puerto Rico, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Katrina, all of the recent disasters, the American Red Cross used this, and it's worked great because Now people that they can't get a hold of their families, they can at least go in there, and if you register and it's on the database, you can see that, you're not gonna have a paragraph to write, but you can say, I'm safe and well,
Right.
or I'm currently at a hotel, I'm safe and in the process of evacuating, there's a lot of canned things that we can write, and this is something that should go out to each neighbor, in your neighborhoods as part of getting the information in so that it can be put into, in this case, the Red Cross's database.
Yeah,
So
yeah, no, it's,
too many people don't know about it.
there's a mechanism that exists already for that, and it's very useful to know, and I wish I'd known about that 22 years ago, right?
I don't know
How long that's been doing,
Not
but
Been there. for
yeah.
years.
it may have actually started precisely because of
Yeah,
so many people being
exactly.
out of communication for so long.
There are resources that we can use as ham radio operators to provide this kind of access to our neighbors and whatnot, right? So, I know at least one guy who was working on a setup that he could put on an open Wi-Fi that people could connect to with their cell phone or tablet or whatever. And there would be like a captive system. They would see this form and they could fill out this form, and that information would be collected and then could be sent via WinLink somewhere. And presumably to somebody who could then process it into a system like this. These tools are out there, these tools exist. We should learn about them and take advantage of them if, an incident happens, but first we've got to get the basic concept of, hey, I'm here, I'm a communications resource. If you're like not able to talk to your family or whoever, come to me, maybe I can get a message out.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't know that necessarily. I mean, I've got a guy in my neighborhood who has a giant antenna. Right now, his radio's not hooked up to it. Doesn't really help much to have the antenna, but people are going to go to him because they look around the neighborhood and say, Charles has a giant antenna. Let's go to Charles, right? They need to know who's out there. We need this kind of communications that we've been talking about needs to happen before the emergency happens.
That's right.
When I go around to my neighbors, I take with me the neighborhood emergency preparedness questionnaire. And this is a form where it describes how many adults are in the home, how many children, any special needs, what skills or services could you volunteer to our neighborhood in case of a large scale emergency. And there's a host of a lot of different options. What equipment or supplies do you have that could be used in a disaster? Ham radio is one of them. Do you have pets that need attention? How many, what kind? Special considerations for your pets? Do you have a 96-hour kit, including water for each household member? How much food storage do you have? Number of months? How many gallons do you have prepared for? And this combination, it gets a dialogue going to anybody in the neighborhood. And this lets them know that there's a mechanism where, you hold on to this form. I'll need it filled out if there's a disaster, one per family, and this here, we would really like to get back so that we can keep in a safe place, not disseminate it to anybody, because I don't want people to know that I have solar panels.
Right.
So it's going to be kept for, your eyes only type of thing. And then if your services or things are needed, there's another form that the bishops have for, I want to know special needs in the family. I want to know where the missionaries are. I want to know, just basic stuff like that. And all of this stuff can be easily had pre-emergency. If it's not in somebody's database, or written down somewhere, and we have the disaster,
Nobody can get at it.
what's the point?
Mhm.
You know? And this is the thing that is hard. You know, I say this so many doggone times, the people who are making up these plans have never actually been in a 7.5 earthquake. You know, they do not know that I will not be able to not only hit that doorway when it hits, but I will not be able to get to that chair in a 7.5 earthquake. How do I know that? Well, I've been through 2 of them. And wherever you're at, that's where you fall, and you cannot move anywhere else. And if you have things that are not attached to studs or joists, those are the stuff that's going to come down on you. You know, if the earthquake is just an earthquake, it's the things flying off the wall and cabinets falling down and picture frames that fly 20 feet from the wall just because of the violent. And this is the thing that people don't get. A 7.5 earthquake is violent. This 5.7 earthquake in Magna, even if you were at ground zero, that is nothing compared to a 7.5. You want to know what violent is? A 7.5 earthquake is violent. It's, I don't know how else to say it. And this is why it's so doggone frustrating to talk to anybody in the church because, or most other people, unless you've lived through an earthquake like that, all it is what you know in Hollywood movies, and of course you're taught, well, that's Hollywood. That's never going to happen like that. You have no idea what it's going to be like, and it is going to be the most frightening. You know, I thought it was interesting in your presentation. The very first thing you talked about is we need, and I was expecting the next slide to be butterflies and you know, so the next thing, the very next slide, you talk about disaster.
Yep.
You know, the police, the SWAT team or the riot control people, you know. There has to be some of that in our discussion because you're either going to be scared now and it'll get you to do something, because when it happens and you're going to be scared like you can't believe, you won't be prepared.
Yeah.
You know, and you might be dead.
Yeah.
Because you haven't prepared.
I think the key is that balance, right? Is we want to present ourselves as a resource, and here's an opportunity for us to come together and have a plan, and we can prepare for things that would be scary, but we're not the tinfoil hat conspiracists who are worried about, you know, crazy things or whatever, right? Because I think sometimes the thing that you're articulating, right, is that people have a hard time believing, well, we've never had that happen before, so it's just never going to happen. And it's like, well, that's true of most things. It never happened until it did, right? So being prepared is the best kind of protection that we can have against it. It doesn't mean that we have to be always doom and gloom, because no one really enjoys that for hours and hours on end either. But there does have to be that element of, there is something scary on the other end of what we're preparing for. And if we are together, you know, we'll be able to survive it and weather it better.
You know, a good example is if you're going through EMT school, there's a lot of theory that goes before you actually do CPR on a live patient out in the road. Okay, I've been through this, so I know what I'm talking about. You talk about, and you're training for the worst case scenario, where you're right. You're training for someone lost an arm, and how do you stop the bleed appropriately? How do you treat for shock? How do you do all this type of stuff? And it's not until you actually practice, it is one thing. You practice until you get muscle memory. And then when you're out in the field, when you're having to scrape somebody's brains off the road because of the guy wasn't wearing a helmet, you know, that's where your training kicks in. You know, we talked about you work like you train like you work, or whatever that saying is. That is so true in a lot of professions, you know, cops, firefighters, or the great one, EMT. And it's critical that we practice our trade. so net control, just everything that we've talked about. Because when things start hitting the fan, we need to not have to think about what we're doing. It needs to be
Absolutely.
automatic.
My battery's dying, so I'm going to drop off the Zoom.
All right. What do we think about?
All right, well, thanks everybody for coming, and we're gonna wrap this up. I'll end the recording. If I can find the button, I will